General Michael Flynn, former National Security Advisor to President Trump, is being investigated by special counsel for accepting legitimate payments from Turkish companies for researching and exposing wanted terrorist and radical Islamist Fethullah Gulen and his $25+ billion criminal network in the United States. Not finding any substantial evidence against Flynn within the Russiagate scope, Mueller's team switched gears and started a Turkeygate. Mueller's prosecution team and FBI agents have spent hours going over the details of Mr. Flynn's perfectly legitimate business dealings with a Turkish-American businessman who worked with Flynn's consulting business, the Flynn Intel Group. Why? Because the business arrangements included research for and exposure of the world's largest radical Islamist network operating in the United States for over 2 decades, the Gulen Network. Mr. Flynn's perfectly legitimate business dealings, 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 Mr. Flynn's perfectly legitimate business.
On September 19th, retired Army Lieutenant General Mike Flynn, then serving as National Security Advisor to the Trump campaign, met in New York City with top Turkish ministers and others at the Essex House Hotel in Manhattan. Among the topics, according to people briefed on the meeting, and former CIA Director James Woolsey, who was also in attendance, removing a Muslim cleric from the U.S. to Turkey. Woolsey said the idea was a covert step to whisk away Fethullah Gulen back to his home country. Turkey accuses Gulen of orchestrating last summer's botched military coup against Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan. A spokesman for Flynn disputes Woolsey's account of the meeting in New York. More on that, but first, here's the backstory. In 2014, Flynn left his job as director of the Defense Intelligence Agency. He founded Flynn Intel Group, a consulting firm that represents international and U.S. clients. Last year, Flynn became an early champion of then-candidate Trump and outspoken critic of then-candidate Hillary Clinton.
They knew that they were going to take highly classified information and move it on to a unclassified system that was not protected.
Days before the Republican National Convention, a faction within Turkey's armed forces attempted a coup against President Erdogan. It failed. Flynn, at the time, was being mentioned as a possible vice president candidate to the GOP's presumptive nominee. He didn't get the job, but after the convention, he stayed on as Trump's key foreign policy advisor, often accompanying him on the campaign trail. In August, Flynn's consulting group began work, according to a later Justice Department filing by the firm, that could be construed to have principally benefited the Republic of Turkey. The contract went through November. The firm's fee? More than $500,000. In September, James Woolsey began advising the Trump campaign. Woolsey says he was asked by the chairman of Flynn Intel Group to join the meeting with Turkish officials at the Essex Hotel. He says he had agreed to be on the group's advisory board, but turned down the role and fees for his work because of what he heard at the September 19th meeting. Woolsey says the discussion did not involve actual tactics for removing Gulen from his compound, and that if it did, he would have spoken up. And he later cautioned it was a bad idea. A spokesman for Flynn said in a statement that at no time did General Flynn discuss any illegal actions, non-judicial physical removal, or any other such activities. Around a week after the presidential election, Trump offered Flynn the job of National Security Advisor. Amid scrutiny of his company's relationship with Turkey, Flynn said he would sever his ties with his consulting firm. Flynn resigned as Mr. Trump's national security advisor in February, just weeks into the job, after acknowledging he misled Vice President Mike Pence about conversations he had with Russia's ambassador to the U.S. prior to the inauguration. He's among those, FBI sources say, who are currently being investigated for their contacts with Russia during the 2016 presidential campaign.
Business dealings, Mr. Flynn's perfectly legitimate 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 business dealings, Mr.